The Duke of Aldermere did not ask for help. Not once. Not in 13 years of managing a condition that could strip him of his title, his dignity, and every carefully constructed wall he had built around both. Not when the episodes came without warning in the middle of negotiations. Not when he had to excuse himself from his own dining table. Not when he woke up on the floor of his study at 2 in the morning with no memory of the previous hour and a cut above his temple from the corner of his desk. He did not ask for help. He managed. He controlled. He ensured that the only person who knew was himself, and he kept that secret with the same iron precision he applied to everything else. Which is why, when it happened in a guest corridor at Lady Pemberton's estate in Hertfordshire, during a thunderstorm, at 2 in the morning, in front of a woman he had known for only 6 weeks, the thing that undid him was not the episode itself. It was the way she looked at him afterward. Not with horror, or pity, or even with the particular bright, hungry shock of someone who had just discovered something they could use. She looked at him the way she looked at everything, clearly, completely, without judgment, without performance, without a single flicker of anything that required him to be other than what he was in that moment, which was a man sitting on a cold corridor floor at 2 in the morning, having just been completely, catastrophically seen. She sat beside him in the dim corridor as the storm moved outside. She didn't move to touch him, neither did she speak. She just simply stayed, with her hands folded in her lap and her green eyes steady, as though sitting in a dark corridor in the small hours of the morning was the most natural thing she had ever been asked to do. After a long while, she said, "How long have you been managing this alone?" He turned to glance at her, but didn't answer. She spoke again. "That's fine. You don't have to tell me." They sat together in silence for a while until she finally stood up. Then she told him his room was the second door on the left, and she went back inside her own. Edmund Cavendish sat in that corridor for another 15 minutes, trying to identify what he was feeling. He had been alone inside his particular fear for 13 years. He did not have the vocabulary for what it meant that someone had now been inside it with him and walked away calmly. He went to his room, but did not sleep. Or should I say he couldn't? Because it was at that moment that Edmund realized that he was in a great deal of trouble.
Welcome to the Duchess Library, where every page holds a treasure. If you want to know how a woman with ink-stained fingers, a borrowed gown, and absolutely no social standing brought the most feared duke in England to his knees, stay right here, because this story is about to get so much better. Like this video, subscribe if you haven't, and share it with someone who loves a good Regency romance, because we are only just beginning.
It started, as most catastrophic things do, in the dark. January, 1815. London. The stone corridors of St. Bartholomew's Hospital before dawn, when the city outside was still a collection of sounds rather than a shape, cartwheels on cobble, a dog barking somewhere distant, the particular grey silence that existed between night and morning in a city that never fully slept. Vivienne Ashcroft had been awake for 19 hours. This was not unusual. What was unusual, to anyone watching, if anyone had been watching, which they were not, was the quality of her attention at the 19th hour. It had not dimmed. It had not wandered. She moved through the corridor with the lamp held low and her eyes moving in their characteristic pattern. Patient, 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 window, patient. Checking. Adjusting. Noting. She stopped at a man in the third bed on the left. Consumptive tradesman, 41, admitted 8 days ago. She had not been asked to check on him. She was not, in any official capacity, staff. She was simply a young woman who had been sleeping on this floor for 4 years and who had, in that time, made herself so quietly useful that the physicians had stopped noticing she wasn't supposed to be there. She adjusted the man's pillow. He didn't wake. His breathing had changed slightly in the past hour. She had been listening, and she shifted his position by 3 degrees, just enough to open the airway. The change in his breathing was immediate. She noted it in the small leather book she kept in her apron pocket, wrote the time, and moved on. "You were in that same spot when I left," said a voice behind her. She did not startle. She turned, and Dr. Samuel Fenwick was in the corridor doorway with his lamp raised, his white hair sticking up at the back in the specific way it always did after midnight, his wire spectacles sitting crookedly on his nose. He had the rumpled, well-used look of a man who had been interesting things to think about for 60 years and hadn't found much time for anything else. 6 hours ago, Vivienne said. "You left 6 hours ago. And you haven't moved." "I've moved considerably. I've simply returned to the same spot." Fenwick walked toward her and pressed a piece of bread into her hand without ceremony. She ate it without ceremony. This was the whole of the exchange. It did not require more than it was. "The Crestwood boy is worse," she said, with her mouth full. "I know. I'll see him at 6. His pulse is irregular in a specific way that worries me." Fenwick looked at her over his spectacles. "What way?" "Write it down and I'll tell you what I think." He produced his notebook. He wrote. She told him, in precise and economical language, what she had observed over the past 3 nights. He listened without interrupting. This was one of the things she valued most about him. He listened the way physicians were supposed to listen, and almost none of them did. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You know what you're describing?" "Yes." "You know what the treatment protocol would be?" "Yes." "You cannot administer it." "I know that." "So you're telling me?" "So I'm telling you." He nodded. He put his notebook away. He did not thank her. They had long since moved past the point where gratitude was required between them, which was itself a form of respect that Vivienne had earned slowly and valued absolutely. He said, "Go and sit down somewhere. You look like you haven't slept since Tuesday." "It is Tuesday." "Then you should be alarmed." She was not alarmed. She was, in fact, the least alarmed person in the building, which was both her greatest strength and, though she did not think about this, the quietest possible form of loneliness. You could not be afraid of a place that had become your entire world. You could only be very, very good at it, and let that be enough. She had let it be enough for 4 years. She was 24 years old. She had been at St. Bartholomew's since she was 20, following the death of her father and the loss of the small, cramped house in the Cheapside streets that had been her entire geography since birth. She had arrived with nothing except a head full of her father's medical books. He had been an apothecary, careful and curious, and the particular combination of stubbornness and precision that made her impossible to dislodge once she had found somewhere useful to stand. She had made herself useful. She had made herself indispensable. She had made herself, in the way of people who are very good at surviving, entirely invisible, known to everyone in the corridor and officially documented by no one. She did not let herself stand at the frosted window at the end of the ward and look at what was on the other side of it. She had learned, early, that there was no value in looking at things you could not reach. She was at her post, lamp low and notebook open, when she heard the sound. Not a crash. Not a cry. A specific, weighted thud, the sound of something with mass meeting a stone floor without preparation, that she identified in the first second, before she had consciously processed it, as a body falling. She was moving before the thought completed itself. The entrance corridor was dark. The night porter had stepped away. She would find out later he'd been to the kitchen, and the doors were unlatched, which meant the man who had arrived by carriage and tried to walk in under his own power had made it exactly 11 feet inside before his heart simply refused the next instruction. He was on his side. 60-something, well-dressed, face the color of old plaster. Vivienne was on her knees beside him before she had finished her assessment, and the assessment took approximately 4 seconds. Not apoplexy. Not a simple faint. Cardiac, the specific profile of it, the color, the positioning of the arm, the quality of the brief, shallow breathing. She had seen this before. She had seen men survive it and men who had not, and the difference, every time, had been minutes. She turned her head and shouted for the night porter with the full force of her lungs, which was considerably more force than her size suggested she possessed. Then she turned back and she worked. What she did in the next 4 minutes was not dramatic in appearance. It looked, from the outside, like a young woman kneeling quietly beside an old man on a cold stone floor. There was no theater to it. She did not panic. She did not pray. She did not perform distress for an audience that did not exist. She applied what she knew, the positioning, the specific pressure to specific points, the monitoring of breath and pulse with her fingertips, with the same systematic calm she had applied to everything for 4 years. Her hands did not shake. Her attention did not waver. The man's eyes opened. Not fully, but enough. amber-brown eyes, warm even in extremis, and they found her face with a particular focus of someone who understood, somewhere below consciousness, that this face was the reason they were still here. He said something. She could not quite hear it. She said, firmly, "Don't speak yet." He said it anyway. It was not coherent, a fragment, a tone, but it was unmistakably grateful in the way of someone who had just been pulled back from a place they were not going to walk out of on their own. His eyes on her face had a quality she recognized with a kind of surprised discomfort. He was seeing her. Not her function. Not the person holding his pulse. Her. Dr. Fenwick arrived at a run with 2 physicians behind him. Vivienne stepped back into the shadows. This was automatic, the reflex of 4 years of official non-existence. She moved out of the light and out of the way, and the physicians took over, and that was how it always went. Except that the old man turned his head, even as they crowded around him. He turned it until he found her in the shadows, standing against the wall with her lamp still in her hand and her notebook still in her apron pocket. He looked at her, and she looked back, and something passed between them that she could not name and would spend the next 4 days trying to forget. She did not forget it. She was not supposed to be there. In the private room Lord Aldermere had arranged within the hour of his admission, his Cavendish family account apparently sufficient to produce a room, a fire, and fresh linens at 4:30 in the morning. She was not supposed to be anywhere officially. But Dr. Fenwick's days were long and his ward was full and the private room needed attending, and Vivienne was, as she had always been, simply present and useful and impossible to dislodge. She brought him broth on the first day. He made a face. "It tastes of nothing," he said. "It tastes of salt and chicken, which is what broth is supposed to taste of. I have had broth prepared by a French cook for 30 years. This is not broth. This is warm water that has been introduced to a chicken and then immediately separated from it. Then think of it as medicine. Medicine should also not taste of nothing. On the contrary, Lord," she stopped. She did not, at this point, know who he was. "On the contrary, sir, the worst medicine I have ever administered tasted of nothing. The dangerous ones are the ones that taste of something pleasant." He looked at her over the broth cup. His amber eyes were amused in a way that had not yet been dimmed by 2 days of hospital bed. He said, "That is either very reassuring or extremely ominous. Drink the broth." He drank the broth. On the second day, she found him sitting up without permission and told him so with a directness that was not rude, exactly, but was entirely without the deference he was accustomed to receiving from women who brought him things. He observed this with visible interest. He asked her name. She told him. He said, "And how long have you been doing this, Vivienne Ashcroft?" She said, "Doing what, specifically?" "Being the most capable person in whatever room you're in, while ensuring that no one official notices." She looked at him. He looked back, steady and warm and completely serious. She said, with great precision, 4 years. "And before that?" "Before that, I was 17 and reading my father's books in a house that is no longer there." He did not press. He simply kept asking different questions, unhurried, conversational, apparently aimless, until she had answered, without quite noticing, the one she had meant to withhold. She learned, in the same unhurried way, about him. Not the title. He was careful about the title, in the way of men who have learned that it tends to change the nature of conversations. He told her about his estate. His wife, who had left some years ago, not dead, simply gone, which was its own category of complicated. His son. He did not say the Duke. He said my son with the specific weight of a father who understood exactly what a person had become and could not reach across to what they had been before. He was a different child, he said, on the 3rd day. He was looking at the fire, not at her. Before he was 11 and understood what he was inheriting. Before he understood that the title required something of him that he couldn't afford to give freely. A pause. He used to laugh at dinner. He used to ask questions that took 20 minutes to answer because he wanted to understand everything. He stopped. He looked at his hands. I let him build the armor. I was proud of how well it fit. That is the thing I am least proud of, in 6 to 7 years. Vivienne was silent. She had been winding a bandage. She stopped. "He will not be pleased," the old man said, "about my proposal." She looked up. "What proposal?" He smiled at her, the warm, slightly guilty smile of a man who had just revealed more than he intended. "I'm getting to it." He got to it the following morning. A footman arrived in Cavendish livery, carrying correspondence and looking deeply uncertain about the quality of the room he was delivering it to. Lord Aldermere accepted the letters and then, with the expression of someone who has decided to remove a splinter quickly, introduced himself in full. Henry Cavendish, Lord Aldermere, father of Edmund Cavendish, Duke of Aldermere. Vivienne received this information. She finished securing the compress she had been applying to his left hand. She laid his hand back on the blanket. She sat down in the chair beside the bed and looked at him for a long moment. She said, "How many people in London would like to know that a woman with no family, no references, and no known address has been alone with the Duke of Aldermere's father for 4 days?" Lord Aldermere said, with great delight, "All of them." "That is a considerable problem. I have a solution." "I haven't asked for one." "You haven't heard it." "I don't require." "You haven't heard it," he said again, gently but with the absolute firmness of a man who had been making people hear things they didn't want to hear for 6 to 7 years. A pause. She looked at him. He looked back, patient and warm and entirely, infuriatingly certain. She sat down. His proposal was not what she expected. She had braced herself for patronage dressed as charity, a reference, a position in a respectable household, the particular flavor of rescue that required you to be grateful for the shape someone else had chosen for your life. What he proposed was a season, full sponsorship, a wardrobe and a dress, vouchers that opened every door in London, and a chaperone, himself, to whatever degree his recovery permitted, into the social world she had spent 4 years watching from a stone corridor floor. She said, "Why?" He said, "Because you are not a person who should be invisible." "You said that before." "I meant it before. I mean it more now." He looked at her steadily. "Because I am an old man with a complicated son and the strong conviction that the world has gone wrong in a particular way, and the way to begin making it right is to put one remarkable, invisible person in the center of it and see what happens. I have no standing, no family, no. You have me. You are unwell. I will be less unwell by next week. I am extraordinarily motivated." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I have one condition." "Name it." "My notebook. My records. Whatever I observe, in drawing rooms, at dinner tables, in any room you put me in, goes into that book. It remains mine. No one reads it. No one uses it. It is mine." He agreed without hesitation. He had, she suspected, already guessed she would ask for something like this. She said, "And the Duke? What about him? You said he won't be pleased." "He won't." "You're telling me this after I've agreed." "I'm telling you this because you already know it, and I thought honesty was more useful than the alternative." He smiled. "He will come around." Vivienne looked at him with a particular expression she reserved for diagnoses she found optimistic. "Will he?" "He respects competence above all things." Lord Aldermere settled back against his pillows with the satisfaction of a man whose plan was unfolding exactly as intended. "You have more competence in your ink-stained right hand than anyone he has ever met. He will simply need time to recognize it." She said, very precisely, "His opinion of my competence is not something I require." Lord Aldermere looked at her. His amber eyes were warm and knowing and thoroughly, quietly amused. He said nothing. She found this more unsettling than if he had argued. Edmund Cavendish arrived the following morning to collect his father, and met instead the situation. He appeared in the doorway and he was, in the first second, exactly what she had prepared herself for, tall, dark, impeccably dressed in charcoal and navy, his face arranged in the particular, pleasant blankness of a man who had spent years ensuring that his face never told anyone anything he had not authorized it to reveal. He assessed her in 4 seconds. She could see him doing it, the rapid, systematic cataloguing of class markers, dress quality, address, bearing, the specific calibration of a man who had been managing threats to his family for a decade. He found wrong class, wrong dress, wrong address, and a confidence she had no social right to be carrying. He found, she thought, rather more than he expected. He turned to his father. He said, very quietly, "Father." Lord Aldermere said, "Edmund. Come in, sit down, this is Vivienne Ashcroft, she saved my life." Edmund did not sit. He said, in the perfectly controlled, perfectly pleasant tone of a man expressing displeasure at a volume only she could hear, "Miss Ashcroft, the household is very grateful for your assistance." She understood this sentence entirely. It meant, the matter is concluded, you are dismissed, I am paying for whatever is appropriate. She said, "Your father was trying to walk into a hospital on his own at 4:30 in the morning during a cardiac episode. Would you have preferred I left him on the floor?" Edmund went very still. She held his gaze. She was not afraid of him, which was not a decision she had made, it was simply a fact about herself, the same way her eye color was a fact. She had spent 4 years in rooms with people who were dying, and a man who was cold and controlled in an expensive coat was, comparatively, an entirely manageable situation. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, with precise and visible effort, "That is not what I suggested." "I know. You suggested the matter is concluded. I'm clarifying that it isn't." Lord Aldermere was watching this exchange with the expression of a man at his first very good play. He said, from his pillows, "Edmund, sit down. I have something to tell you." Edmund Saturday. He listened to his father's proposal with his face perfectly still and his eyes moving, once, to Vivienne, and then back to his father, and then to the middle distance, in the sequence of a man processing something he has immediately decided to oppose and is already, underneath that decision, beginning to recalculate. When Lord Aldermere finished, Edmund said, "No. Yes. Father. It is decided. You cannot." Edmund. Lord Aldermere said his son's name with the particular, quiet weight of a man who had been saying it for 32 years and knew precisely how much pressure to apply. "I was on a stone floor 4 days ago. This woman was the reason I am not still on it. You will do this." Silence. Edmund looked at Vivienne. She met the look without expression. He was measuring something. She could feel it, the specific quality of his attention, like a hand testing the weight of something unexpected. He was trying to determine if she was a threat. He was trying to determine what she wanted. He was trying to categorize her and discovering, with the faint, visible tightening around his eyes that she was beginning to understand as his version of surprise, that she did not fit any category he had ready. He said, finally, "I will consider it." Lord Aldermere smiled. Vivienne heard this as agreement. Edmund left. Lord Aldermere said, the moment the door closed, "You see? He is coming around already." She gave him the look she reserved for his most optimistic diagnoses. He was right, though, which she filed away and did not mention again. A week later, Vivienne Ashcroft stood in the fitting room of Aldermere House in a pale champagne gown that belonged to someone else's daughter, while Lord Aldermere's formidably efficient housekeeper, Mrs. Poole, attempted to address the fact that the shoulders sat 2 inches too wide. "It can be adjusted in a morning," Mrs. Poole said, with the particular urgency of a woman for whom incorrectly fitted clothing was a personal affront. "I know. The seam is visible. I'm aware. It will be the first thing anyone notices." Vivienne looked at herself in the long mirror. The gown was beautiful, genuinely beautiful, the silk catching the winter light in a way that suggested warmth without generating any, and the shoulders were wrong, and she looked like herself. Which was to say, real and slightly imprecise, and entirely unwilling to be something else to make the room more comfortable. She said, "Leave it." Mrs. Poole made the sound of a woman in physical pain. From the corridor doorway, where he had appeared with no apparent intention of remaining, Edmund said nothing. He had a letter in his hand and the quality of stillness that suggested he had been there for longer than he was prepared to acknowledge. Vivienne saw him in the mirror. She did not turn around. He left. Mrs. Poole recovered herself sufficiently to say, "He has never once appeared at a fitting in this household. In 16 years. Vivienne filed this. She filed everything. The Hartwell musicale was not the grandest event of the season, which made it the perfect first test. The room was intimate enough for close scrutiny and prestigious enough to matter, and when Vivienne walked in on Lord Aldermere's arm in the champagne gown with the incorrectly fitted shoulders, she felt the room's attention move across her like weather. Surface level, polite curiosity. Who is this? Middle level, rapid social calculation. Who is she connected to? Bottom level, Lord Aldermere's sponsorship means she cannot be dismissed, which is irritating. She observed all three simultaneously, the way she observed everything, not performing the observation, simply doing it, the way breathing is done. She catalogued faces and names as they were introduced, 12 in 20 minutes, and retained all of them with the automatic precision of a woman who had been committing medical details to memory for 4 years and found society's data considerably less complex. She noted Viscount Crestwood in the third group of introductions, a soft-faced man in his 40s, sweating faintly despite the room's temperature. She knew his file. She adjusted her conversational angle slightly to ensure she was steering away from him before he could recognize her from the corridor, which she suspected he would not, but which was not a risk she was prepared to take tonight. She met Lady Arabella Forsyth near the fireplace. Arabella was everything the room approved of, golden, rounded, perfectly dressed, smiling with a precise warmth that indicated significant practice. Her eyes were china blue and lovely, and her expressions arrived, Vivienne noted, approximately half a second after the emotion they were supposed to be expressing. This was not performance born of insincerity. It was performance born of a woman who had been told, for so long, that the feeling was less important than the appearance of the feeling that she now had to think before she showed either. Vivienne found this, unexpectedly, more interesting than threatening. "Miss Ashcroft," Arabella said, with the smile. "I have heard so much about you." "I'm certain you have," Vivienne said, with an equally warm smile and absolutely no qualification of what she meant by it. Arabella blinked. Very slightly. 1 point to Vivienne. Edmund was nearby for much of the evening. Not near her, he was careful about that, maintaining the correct social distance, engaging with 3 different conversations with the polished ease of a man who had been managing rooms since he was 19. But he was there, in her peripheral vision, occasionally closer than he had been a moment before, in the way of someone who was not tracking her location but happened, repeatedly, to be standing where she was. She noticed. She said nothing. On the carriage home, Lord Aldermere asked how she found it. She said, 12 people who wanted something from someone they hadn't spoken to yet. 4 people whose ailments I recognized without them telling me. 1 man who will be dead in 6 months if he doesn't change his diet. And the best string quartet I have heard in my life. Lord Aldermere laughed until he coughed. It was the best sound she had heard in years. She was still near the warmth of it, standing at the edge of the drawing room with a glass of wine she had not touched, when Margaret Cavendish appeared beside her. She had not seen her coming. That was the first thing to note. The dowager moved like water, filling space without seeming to enter it, arriving without approach. She was immaculate in black silk, her silver blonde hair pinned with mathematical precision, her pearl choker sitting at her throat like armor she had been born wearing. She smiled at Vivienne. It arrived exactly where smiles were socially required and stopped precisely at her eyes. "Miss Ashcroft," she said, warmly. "What a charming gown." "Thank you. The silk is lovely." She paused, just long enough, just precisely long enough, and spoke at a volume calibrated to carry to exactly the right ears in the surrounding 3 feet of space. "I wonder if the shoulder might be adjusted. It appears the modiste may have worked in some haste. I know an excellent woman on Bond Street, if you should need a recommendation." And then she was gone, moving across the room to Edmund with the unhurried grace of a woman who had not just said anything at all. Vivienne stood perfectly still. Her hands did not move. She was aware, with the analytical clarity she applied to problems, of exactly what had just happened. She had been assessed, marked as a charity case in borrowed clothing, and dismissed, in 4 sentences of apparent kindness, in front of enough people to matter, with absolutely no mechanism of direct response available to her. She was also aware that she was facing an opponent who was very, very good at what she did. She reached up, once, and smoothed the shoulder of the gown. Felt the slight, wrong fit of it. She left it. She stood straighter. She looked across the room, and the Dowager Duchess of Aldermere was standing beside her son, and Edmund was watching his mother speak with an expression that revealed, for just a fraction of a second, that he knew exactly what had just happened. His eyes found Vivienne across the room. She held the look. She did not look away. He was, she thought, beginning to understand that she wasn't going to. And then, 3 mornings later, a royal footman arrived at Aldermere House during breakfast. He asked for Miss Ashcroft by name, produced a sealed note with no crest and no signature, and left. Vivienne unfolded it. 6 words. Your skills have been noted. Wait. She read it 3 times. She put it in her pocket, next to her notebook. She finished her breakfast. She did not tell Lord Aldermere. She did not tell Edmund. She was already a piece on 3 different boards. She understood that. And the season had barely begun. That night, she stood at the window of her Aldermere house room with London spread out below her in lamplit grey. The champagne gown, the one with the wrong shoulders, the one she had not adjusted and would not adjust, was folded on the chair behind her. Her notebook was open in her hands. She was writing. Her face was not happy, exactly. But it was something that might become happiness, she thought, if left undisturbed long enough. 2 floors below, Edmund Cavendish sat in his study with a full desk of correspondence he had not opened. He was thinking about a woman who had walked into a room full of his peers and had not been afraid of any of them. He was thinking about the particular steadiness of her eyes and the way she had looked at his mother across the drawing room. Not with fear, not with anger, with something far more dangerous. Complete, clear-eyed understanding. He was thinking about this more than he would like. Considerably more than was sensible. And the thing about Edmund Cavendish was that he was, above all things, an honest man with himself, which meant he could not pretend he didn't know exactly what that meant. He opened the first letter. He closed it again. He sat in the quiet of his study and allowed himself, just briefly, one completely unguarded thought. He was in a great deal of trouble. 3 weeks into the season, Vivienne had learned the following things about London society. It ran on performance, it fed on weakness, and it had an extraordinary, almost artistic talent for making cruelty sound like concern. She had also learned that she was considerably better at it than she had expected. Not the performance. She had no interest in performance. But the observation. The cataloguing. The rapid, systematic reading of a room that she had spent 4 years applying to corridors full of suffering people and was now, with minor adjustment, applying to corridors full of suffering egos. The skills transferred with unsettling precision. Almack's was the first real test. The assembly rooms were everything the ton considered sacred. The vouchers, the patronesses, the particular, exclusive arithmetic of who was admitted and who was politely, firmly, permanently redirected. Vivienne walked in on Lord Aldermere's arm and felt the room perform its calculation on her in the first 30 seconds. She waited. She found her footing. And then, during a conversation about the crop failures in the northern counties, she made a remark about the relationship between soil drainage and yield patterns that stopped 3 men mid-sentence. One of them was a duke. He asked her to dance. The room was scandalized in the specific, electric way of people who did not know what category to put something in. Lord Aldermere watched from the side of the room with an expression of profound personal satisfaction. The Dowager, across the floor, made a small, precise note behind her fan and said nothing. Edmund was not at Almack's that evening. She noticed his absence the way you notice a change in weather, not dramatically, simply as a fact about the atmosphere. Hyde Park, 4 days later, was a different matter entirely. She was riding, one of Lord Aldermere's quieter mares, a sensible grey who seemed to share Vivienne's opinion of unnecessary theatrics, when Edmund fell into pace beside her on a dark bay that moved with the controlled, impatient energy of a horse that belonged to a man who was also controlled and impatient. He said, "The drainage argument at Almack's." She said, "Good morning to you too. You cited Tull's methods. I cited the practical application of Tull's methods, which is a different thing. Citing the theory without the application is how you get conversations that sound intelligent and accomplish nothing. That is a description of most conversations in that room." "Yes," she said. "I know." He looked at her. She was watching the path ahead, her posture easy on the horse, her grey-green eyes doing their characteristic thing, moving, noting, filing. He said, You disagree with the drainage approach. I think it addresses the symptom rather than the cause. The issue isn't water retention in the soil, it's the rotation pattern. If you change the rotation, you need the drainage to make the rotation viable in the first instance. Only if your primary crop is wheat. If you're diversified. Diversification requires capital that most tenant farmers in the northern counties don't have. She turned to look at him. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, not the controlled assessment of their early encounters, not the careful blankness he maintained in social situations. He was simply engaged. Completely, directly, without performance. She said, "You've read Tull." "I've read everything relevant to the management of 12,000 acres. It would be irresponsible not to. Most men in your position have stewards for that. Most men in my position don't read their stewards' reports closely enough to disagree with them." She was quiet for a moment. The horses moved. London's park noise moved around them, other riders, birdsong, the distant sound of carriages on the outer road. She said, "The rotation approach requires a 5-year patience horizon that most landowners find uncomfortable." He said, 5 years is nothing on a 12,000-acre estate that has been in a family for 200 years. She said, "That is a reasonable position." He said, "You sound surprised." She said, "I'm recalibrating." He said nothing to this. But she thought, she was almost certain, that the corner of his mouth moved. It was the smallest possible movement, barely a crease, entirely contained. On any other face she might have missed it. On his face, she was beginning to understand, it was the equivalent of a laugh. They reached the end of the path and stopped. Both of them slightly breathless. Neither of them quite knowing why, given that the horses had been walking. He said, "Miss Ashcroft." She said, "Your Grace." They turned their horses and rode back in opposite directions, and she spent the rest of the morning trying to remember what she had been thinking about before he had fallen into pace beside her. She could not. Lord Pemberton's dinner that Friday seated her next to the Earl of Pembroke, who was charming in the easy, effortless way of men who had never needed to try. He told a story about a hunting trip in Scotland that was genuinely funny. The timing was excellent, the self-deprecation precisely calibrated, and Vivienne laughed at it, which she did not do often and which seemed to please him considerably. He asked about her background with the smooth, interested warmth of a man making conversation. She gave him the version she had refined over 3 weeks, the apothecary father, the hospital work, Lord Aldermere's sponsorship. Short, accurate, unrevealing. He listened with his hazel eyes warm and attentive. And then, near the end of the second course, the firelight shifted. The candles on the table caught the angle of her face and the color of her eyes, the specific greenish-brown of them in warm light, the hazel that her father's mirror had shown her since childhood. Pembroke's expression changed. It was very small and very fast, and he controlled it within a second. But Vivienne, who watched people with the same systematic attention she watched patients, saw it clearly. It was not attraction. It was not recognition in any social sense. It was something older and more complicated, the look of a man who has seen something he was not prepared to see and needs a moment to understand what it means. He covered it with excellent technique. He smiled, he poured her wine, he redirected the conversation to the question of the upcoming vote in the Lords. She responded appropriately, on the surface. Underneath, she filed it. She did not know what she was filing, but she filed it. The story about the gown's shoulder seam, she discovered from Lady Stanhope's morning call that week, had grown considerably in the retelling. It was no longer a slightly imprecise fit. It was now a gown from a previous season, visibly remade, worn by a woman Lord Aldermere had taken in as a charity case following the discovery that she had no family and no prospects. The modiste was said to be a woman from the Cheapside streets who had never set foot in Bond Street. None of this was true. The gown was borrowed, yes, and it did not fit perfectly at the shoulders, yes, but everything else was invention. Vivienne sat in Lady Stanhope's drawing-room and listened to a version of herself be assembled from other people's assumptions, and she was so entirely calm about it that the woman sitting beside her, who had been watching for a reaction, eventually gave up watching and poured more tea. The campaign, Vivienne understood, had a director. Organic gossip did not have this quality of precision. Organic gossip wandered and exaggerated randomly. This exaggerated in a specific direction, repeating the same details. No family, charity case, Cheapside, with a consistency that indicated a source controlling the narrative's shape. She thought about the dowager at the music-hall. 4 sentences. The correct ears. The perfect tone. She thought about how long Margaret Cavendish had been managing this world, and how good someone becomes at warfare when they have been practicing it for 30 years. She wrote it all down. She went home. She thought. The news about Viscount Crestwood arrived on a Tuesday morning, mid-call, in Lady Crestwood's own drawing room. It moved through the room the way bad news always moved through the ton, quickly, with a quality of excitement that the participants would not have admitted to, dressed in the language of shock and sympathy. Heart failure. The physician had confirmed it. The funeral would be Friday. Vivienne went very still. She knew Crestwood's file. She had monitored his pulse pattern for 2 weeks, 3 months ago, when he had come in with what the admitting physician had called fatigue, but which she had identified as something more specific, a cardiac irregularity that was serious but manageable, not the profile of a man whose heart would simply stop without warning in the night. She knew the symptom profile of sudden death in a man of his age and constitution. She knew the compound that could produce it. She knew the dose that left nothing obvious behind, and she knew that the knowledge required to calculate it precisely was not common. It existed in medical texts. It existed in hospital records, specifically, in the records of patients who had received it and patients who had received too much of it. She excused herself from the morning call. The street outside was cold and bright, the January air sharp enough to clarify thought, which was what she needed it to do. She stood on the pavement and worked through it the way she worked through a diagnosis. Facts, then inference, then conclusion. Crestwood had been paying to keep a secret. She knew that from his file, from the specific anxiety she had observed in him at the music-hall, from the pattern of his visits to the hospital that had nothing to do with his stated ailments and everything to do with the records room 2 floors above the ward. Someone with access to those records had killed him. And they had chosen him first, which meant he was not random. He was a test. A proof of concept. The first step in something that was not yet finished. She wrote 4 lines in her notebook, her handwriting small and very precise. Then she flagged a hackney and told the driver to take her to Aldermere House. She asked Edmund's butler for 15 minutes. He informed her that the Duke was occupied. She informed him that she was aware of that and would still like 15 minutes. The butler, who had been managing the Duke's household for 9 years and had never in that time been told by a woman that his answer was insufficient, took a moment to recalibrate and then went upstairs. Edmund appeared in the hall himself. Not the butler, him. Which told her, before she had said a word, that she had his attention. In his study, she laid it out. No editorializing, no qualification, no hedging. Facts, Crestwood's medical profile, the compound, the dose, the knowledge required, the source of that knowledge. Inference, the records. Conclusion, murder, deliberate, targeted, and executed by someone with access to Bartholomew's files. Edmund listened without interrupting. This surprised her. She had expected, not dismissal, precisely, but the particular, careful management of a man deciding how much of what a woman said he was willing to credit. She had encountered that quality of listening her entire life. It had a particular texture to it, a slight delay, a faint air of translation. His listening had none of that. He was simply receiving what she said, accurately, at full value. When she finished, he asked 4 questions. They built on each other in the sequence of a legal argument, each one using the answer to the previous as its foundation. She answered all 4. At the end of the 4th, he sat back in his chair and looked at his desk. He said, "Your notebook." She said, "No." He looked up. She said, "The records in that book are private medical information about identifiable people. I will tell you what I know. I will not give you the mechanism by which I know it." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, "All right." She had expected him to argue. The absence of argument created a brief, strange pause in her chest that she attributed to surprise and filed away. They discussed what to do. The conclusion arrived at itself, which was that they would watch, her watching the people whose file she held, him watching the people she didn't. Neither of them named what this was. But when she left his study 40 minutes later, the thing that had been unnamed between them had a shape, and the shape was partnership, and she walked home through the January cold thinking about the fact that she had spent 4 years making herself useful to people who did not officially see her, and had now apparently made herself useful to one who did. She was not sure what to do with that. The Carlton House carriage arrived on a Wednesday morning, 10 days later, while Edmund was at his club and Lord Aldermere was asleep. Vivienne told the household she was visiting a dressmaker and got in. The Viscount Hartwell received her in a plainly furnished room off the main receiving suite. He was a lean, precise man in civilian clothes that sat on him like a uniform he had been asked to take off but hadn't quite managed, and he looked at her with green eyes that had been measuring threats for 20 years and now measured everything out of habit. He did not offer her tea. She respected this. She asked him, directly, whether the room meant she was unimportant or that the meeting was meant to be invisible. He said, without any social lubrication whatsoever, the second. She said, "All right. What do you need?" He told her. The king's condition. The physicians who were divided along lines that were not purely medical. The political factions who needed specific outcomes and had found various ways to encourage the physicians toward producing them. He needed an independent assessment. Someone with no court position, no alliance, no stake in either outcome. She said, "I am a woman with no credentials and no professional standing." He said, "Yes. That is also useful." She agreed, on her terms. The report goes to him alone. She chooses what she reports. No one else in this building hears her name. He agreed to all three with the directness of a man who found conditions attached to help refreshing rather than insolent. He said, as she stood to go, "You are the first person who has attached conditions to helping the Crown this week." She said, "I imagine most people don't think they can." He said, "Most people are correct." He paused. "You are not most people." She went to see the king. She spent 40 minutes in a quiet room with a man who was tired and confused at intervals and, in his clearer moments, completely, precisely rational. She took no notes in the room. She memorized everything, and wrote it in her notebook the moment the door closed, in the anteroom, her handwriting rapid and small. Her conclusion was this: the king had capacity at intervals. His condition was complex but not permanent, and the treatment he was receiving, the laudanum his current physicians administered with a regularity that had nothing to do with his fluctuating symptoms, was making him worse. Measurably, specifically worse. She told Hartwell. He was quiet for a long time after she finished. He said, "You understand what you have done." She said, "I understand what I found. Those are not the same thing." He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man recalibrating. Then he told her the truth, plainly, without softening it, about what both factions would do when they learned she existed. She walked out of Carlton House into the cold February air with her notebook in her pocket and the clear, cold understanding that she had just made herself simultaneously necessary and dangerous to people with the power to destroy her. She had been in that position before, she reflected. The building was better. Lady Pemberton's estate in Hertfordshire was everything the Ton considered a proper country retreat. 40 rooms, a formal garden buried in snow, fires that actually drew, and 12 guests carefully selected to appear accidental while being anything but. Vivienne arrived on a Tuesday and understood the room within the first hour. Edmund's political allies on one side of the dinner table. Arabella's mother on the other, with Arabella beside her in blush silk, her perfect ringlets dressed with white flowers, her china blue eyes performing delight at the quality of the soup. Lord Aldermere at the head of the table, looking satisfied in the way he always looked when his plans were in motion. Two of Pembroke's friends near the window, attached, Vivienne had established, to the Carlton House faction. She ate her soup. She listened. She filed. Edmund sat at the far end of the table. She was aware of his location without looking. The second day was parlour games, charades, specifically, after the morning's outdoor pursuits had been curtailed by fresh snow that nobody wanted to admit they were grateful for. The guests divided into teams. Vivienne ended up opposite Edmund and discovered, within the first 5 minutes, that he was completely ruthless at parlour games in the specific, contained, entirely controlled way of a man who refused to lose at anything while also maintaining the appearance of not caring whether he won. She was also completely ruthless at parlour games. The room found this delightful. They were, within 20 minutes, playing to the room's amusement while both absolutely serious about the outcome. She won. By 2 points. He looked at her across the parlor with an expression that was not quite displeasure and not quite admiration. She looked back with an expression that was not quite satisfied and not quite smug. "You counted the letters," he said. "Obviously," she said. "That's not in the rules. There's no rule against it. The spirit of the game." I didn't realize we were playing the spirit of the game. Lord Aldermere, in the corner, was having the best day of his recent life. That night, the storm came. It arrived in stages, first the wind, then the rain against the windows, then the specific quality of darkness that meant clouds had moved across the moon and the world outside had reduced itself to sound and pressure. The house settled into its storm quiet. Guests retired. Candles were put out along the corridor one by one. Vivienne could not sleep. She sat at the small desk in her room with her notebook open, working through the structure of what she knew, the killer, the records, the specific profile of the compound, with the focused, quiet attention that she gave to problems she had not yet solved. The storm was louder than London's nights. It was, in its way, comfortable. She had always been better in difficult weather than in calm. She heard it at 2:30. Not a crash. Not a dramatic sound. A specific quality of movement in the corridor, the particular, effortful stillness of someone trying to move through a space and not quite managing it. She had heard this quality of movement before. In a hospital corridor. At 4 in the morning. In people between one state and another. She opened her door. Edmund was in the corridor, braced against the wall. He had been trying to reach his room from the library below, and the episode had begun on the stairs. He had made it this far, which told her something about the quality of his will, but he was not going to make it further, which told her something about the limits of will when the body had a different plan. He was not fallen. But he was between. She crossed to him in 3 steps. She did not call for anyone. She did not make noise. She did what she had always done in the corridor at St. Bartholomew's. She assessed, she moved, she acted. She guided him to the floor. She did it the way she did everything, precisely, efficiently, with her hands steady and her face completely calm. She watched, and waited, and stayed. She did not look away. When it passed, he came back to himself slowly. The corridor was dim. The storm moved outside. He was on the floor with his back against the wall, and Vivienne was sitting beside him, not touching him now, her hands folded in her lap, her grey-green eyes level and steady. He looked at her. He waited for what he had seen on every other face, the horror, the pity, the specific bright hunger of discovery. The face people made when they found the thing you had spent years ensuring they would never find. Her face had none of it. She was looking at him the way she looked at everything. Clearly. Completely. With full, direct attention that held nothing back and demanded nothing in return. The storm moved. The corridor was cold. Neither of them spoke. He said, "You should leave." She said, "In a moment." She stayed. Not hovering, simply present. The specific, unhurried presence of someone who was not uncomfortable with difficulty and did not need the difficult thing to be over in order to function. She gave him time. Real time. Not the managed, apologetic time of people who need you to recover quickly so they can stop witnessing you. Time that belonged to him. After a while, she asked, "How long have you been managing this alone?" He said nothing. She said, "That's fine. You don't have to." She stood. She told him his room was the second door on the left. She looked at him one last time, clear, calm, without performance, and went back inside her own. He sat in the corridor for another 15 minutes. 13 years. He had been alone inside it for 13 years, and he had convinced himself that aloneness was a form of protection. For himself, for his family, for everyone who would otherwise have to carry the knowledge of it. He had convinced himself that the fear lived in the knowing, and the knowing had to be prevented. She knew. She had been inside it with him. And she had walked away calmly. She had not needed him to be anything other than what he was. He sat in the corridor and tried to find a word for what that felt like, and he could not, because he had never had the occasion to learn it. He went to his room. He lay down. He looked at the ceiling while the storm moved over the house. He did not sleep. He was too busy understanding something he had been determined not to understand, which was that 13 years of being alone inside a thing does not prepare you for the moment someone walks into it with you. It only makes you understand, very precisely, how long you have been cold. Breakfast the next morning was a social performance he managed with the automatic efficiency of 20 years of practice. He was dressed and present and composed. He arrived exactly on time. He was perfectly, entirely himself. He did not look at Vivienne. She did not look at him. The table chatted around them. 3 minutes after she stepped onto the terrace afterward, he followed. He had not planned to. Or he had planned not to, which was a different thing entirely and produced the same result. The garden was buried in last night's snow, untouched, very white and very still. She was standing with her hands folded over the stone balustrade, looking at it. She did not turn when she heard him. He stood beside her. He said, "I would prefer that the event of last night remained between us." She said, "I assumed that." He said, "I am aware I have not given you particular reason to protect my confidence." She said, "No, you haven't." A pause, brief and without cruelty. "I will anyway." He turned to look at her. She was still looking at the garden. She said, "Because what you are carrying is heavy and you are carrying it alone, and those two things are not a moral failing." She glanced at him. "In my professional opinion." He did not thank her. He did not have words for the specific shape of what gratitude felt like when it arrived in this particular form, not the gratitude you feel for a favor, but the gratitude you feel for being seen, for being found inside the thing you had hidden and still being, somehow, worth staying beside. His face, just for a moment, before the armor reassembled, before the composure returned, before he became the Duke of Aldermere again, was the face of a man who had been alone for a very long time and had just been told he didn't have to be. She looked back at the garden. He looked at her profile. The winter light. The small, escaped pieces of auburn hair at her temple. The absolute steadiness of her, which was not coldness, he understood that now, fully, but something more complicated and more difficult. The steadiness of someone who had learned to be their own ground because no one else had offered to be. He wanted, with a clarity that surprised him entirely, to be different ground than she had been given. He said nothing. He was not ready to say it. He was also beginning to understand that not being ready had never, in Vivienne Ashcroft's company, protected him from anything at all. Back in London, the Dowager received a visitor she did not acknowledge receiving. He arrived through the servants' entrance, which was an arrangement they had both agreed upon and which the Dowager considered merely practical. He was a thin man of law, a solicitor named Graves, who managed certain accounts for certain clients and had, in the past 2 years, discovered that he could manage considerably more profitable accounts on the side. He told her what he had. Records from Bartholomew's, not the originals, those were still in the hospital, but copies, made carefully over many months by a clerk who had been told he was assisting a legitimate legal inquiry and had not been told anything else. Records of ailments, treatments, the private medical histories of some of the most powerful families in London. The Dowager asked one question: could he make Miss Ashcroft's position in London untenable without exposing the families the records implicated? He said he could manage it. She agreed to his terms. Afterward, alone, she stood at her window and allowed herself the thing she did not examine in company. Not triumph. Fear. The specific, cold fear of a woman who has spent 30 years building a world for her son and watched it begin to tilt the moment a girl in a borrowed gown walked into it. She had seen Edmund's face at the Hertfordshire breakfast. Before he remembered, she was watching. She had seen what it looked like when the armor opened. She had built that armor. Piece by piece, year by year, in response to every crisis he had not been able to control. She had built it because the world was cruel to weakness and Edmund's weakness could not be allowed to be visible. She had built it because she loved him. She told herself this. She believed it. She did not ask herself whether the thing she had just set in motion was love or something that wore love's clothing and had, underneath, a different name. At Lord Hartwell's soiree that same evening, the Earl of Pembroke stood across a crowded room and watched Vivienne Ashcroft stand near a fireplace. The firelight was amber. It caught her face at a precise angle, and her eyes, the hazel in them, the greenish-brown that he had spent 24 years not thinking about, were visible in the light in a way they had not been in the daylight of Hyde Park or the candlelight of Pemberton's dinner. He set his drink down. Very carefully. He looked at her for a long moment. She was listening to a woman beside her, her attention complete and unhurried, unaware of him. He calculated, the timing, the features, the name that had been shared with him at the hospital. Ashcroft. Not the mother's name. A changed name. A hidden origin. He calculated the probability. He arrived at a number that sat in his chest like cold water. He crossed the room and complimented her earrings. She thanked him pleasantly and turned back to her companion. He retreated to the window with his drink and stood looking at the room without seeing it. A man who had spent his life managing consequences understood, in the particular, visceral way that surprises only the willfully blind, that the consequence he had avoided for 24 years had just walked into his city, into his season, into his social circle, in a champagne gown with the wrong-fitted shoulders and the eyes he had been pretending for 2 decades that he had forgotten. He had not forgotten. He finished his drink. He did not enjoy the rest of the evening. He went home and sat in his study and understood that Vivienne Ashcroft was not a problem he could manage the way he had managed every other problem in his comfortable, careful life. She was the problem that was going to require him, for the first time, to be honest. He was not sure he remembered how. The story that reached Vivienne came in pieces, the way all damaging things do, not as a single blow but as a series of small, precise cuts, each one arriving before the last had finished bleeding. The first piece came from a lady's maid who had been overheard by the wrong person at the right moment. The second from a morning call at Lady Featherstone's, where Vivienne was not present but her name was. The third from Lord Aldermere himself, who arrived at the breakfast table on a Thursday morning and set down his coffee cup with the careful deliberateness of a man who had rehearsed how he was going to say something and was now doing it. He said, "There is a story circulating." She looked at him. She waited. He said it steadily, without flinching, which she was grateful for. The story was this, that Miss Vivienne Ashcroft, currently residing at Aldermere House under Lord Aldermere's sponsorship, had spent 4 years at St. Bartholomew's Hospital not as a charitable young woman making herself useful, but as a deliberate and systematic collector of the ton's private medical information. That she kept records, detailed, specific, damaging records, of the ailments and treatments and private weaknesses of London's most powerful families. That she had assembled this information with intent. That the intent was not yet specified, which was, she understood immediately, the most dangerous part. An unspecified intent allowed every person who heard it to insert whatever they feared most. When Lord Aldermere finished, he looked at her steadily and said, "Tell me to my face that it isn't true." She said, "I keep records. I have always kept records. The records are medical observations made by a woman doing the only work available to her in the only place that would have her. There is no intent beyond usefulness." He said, "I know that." She said, "Then why are you asking?" He said, quietly, "Because I wanted to give you the opportunity to hear yourself say it before the rest of London asks you in a room with worse lighting." She put down her own coffee cup. Her hands were steady. She said, "Who is directing it?" Lord Aldermere was quiet for a moment. He looked at his hands. He was 67 years old and he had been managing difficult knowledge for 67 years, and she watched him, in that pause, carry the specific weight of a man who knows the answer and wishes he didn't. He said, "I don't know for certain." She said, "But you suspect." He said nothing, which was its own answer. She excused herself from breakfast. She went to her room. She stood at the window for 60 seconds, looking at the street below, ordinary, bright, the morning traffic of a city that did not yet know it was supposed to be interested in her, and then she sat down at her desk and opened her notebook. She turned to a fresh page. She wrote, in her small, precise hand, "What I know. What I can prove. What I cannot afford to say yet." She filled each column methodically. When she was finished, she looked at the third column for a long time. Then she closed the notebook, put it in her apron pocket, and went to get dressed for Lady Morecambe's dinner. She had been invited before the story broke, and she had spent 3 minutes considering whether to attend, and had decided in the affirmative because retreating from a room you had not yet entered was a form of concession she was not prepared to make. She was going. She was wearing the deep blue gown, not the champagne one, not tonight. The deep blue, which fit correctly at the shoulders because Lord Aldermere had insisted on a second gown from an actual London modiste, and she had, in a moment of pragmatism, agreed. If there was going to be a battle, she was going to choose her clothes for it. Lady Morecambe's dinner table sat 22 people, and Vivienne had been placed, by the hostess's seating arrangement, near the centre of it, not at the edges where unimportant guests were traditionally situated, but in the visible middle, where the conversation moved through everyone and no one could pretend not to hear it. She understood, within the first course, that Lady Morecambe was not her enemy. The placement was kindness, a woman who had decided to make a statement with a seating chart because she could not make it with words. Vivienne noted this and was quietly grateful and said nothing about it. Edmund was at the far end of the table. He had arrived before her, and when she entered the room, his eyes found her with the immediate, automatic precision of a man who had stopped pretending, at least to himself, that he was not keeping track of where she was. The first two courses passed in the ordinary currency of dinner conversation: the weather, the upcoming parliamentary session, someone's new horses. Vivienne ate and listened and contributed with the measured, pleasant engagement of a woman who was using every particle of her considerable attention to monitor the room. She saw it coming. Not the specific words. She could not hear the murmuring at the far end of the table where Lord Dunmore's cousin, a thin-faced man named Cavendish Holt, had been bending his neighbour's ear since the soup. But the quality of it. The way a conversation's energy changes when it is about to expand, the specific gathering stillness of a room preparing to listen. The footmen were pouring the third wine. The table was at its loudest. And then Cavendish Holt produced a letter. He did it with the practiced, regretful air of a man performing a public service, the tone of someone who would very much prefer not to share this but feels, given the circumstances, obligated. He read from it in a conversational voice that carried exactly as far as he intended it to carry, which was to every ear at the table. The letter described the woman currently resident at Aldermere House. Her practice of cataloguing the private medical information of respectable families. The years of systematic observation. The documents she maintained. The purposes, as yet unclear, for which this intelligence had been assembled. The table went quiet. Not all at once, in the specific, rippling way of 22 people performing the same calculation at slightly different speeds. Vivienne watched it happen the way she watched symptoms progress, recognizing each stage, timing each transition, noting which faces resolved into belief, which into calculation, which into the careful blankness of people who had not yet decided. She did not look down. She did not look at Edmund, though she was aware of him with the peripheral intensity of someone who understood, without looking, that he had gone very still. She looked at the middle distance. Her hands were in her lap, folded, completely still. She looked like a woman at rest. She was the furthest thing from a woman at rest. She was deciding, in the approximately 15 seconds that Cavendish Holt's voice took to stop and the silence to complete its first full circuit, exactly what her response was going to be. The silence completed. She said, in a conversational tone that required no raising to carry, "I wonder if Mr. Cavendish Holt would be willing to share the author of that letter. I have some professional curiosity about the source." Nobody answered. The silence stretched one beat further than was comfortable. Then Lady Morecambe asked whether anyone had tried the pheasant, and the dinner continued. But the shape of what Vivienne had done, refusing to flinch, refusing to apologize, refusing to perform the distress the room had been waiting for, sat in the air above the table for the rest of the meal. She had not defended herself. She had noted, very calmly, where the blow had come from. She had made it clear that she was paying attention. And she had looked, through the whole of it, not like a woman being destroyed, but like a woman collecting information. Edmund, at the far end of the table, did not take his eyes off her for the remainder of the evening. The morning after, 3 invitations did not arrive. Not cancelled, not renewed. The distinction was important. Cancellation required acknowledgement. Non-renewal required nothing. It was the social equivalent of a door that simply ceased to open, with no explanation and no mechanism of complaint. A woman Vivienne had been walking with in the park sent her visiting card with no note. The small, intimate correspondence that had been accumulating, requests for calls, invitations to afternoon events, the quiet, warm traffic of women who had been deciding whether to know her, stopped. She sat with the morning's post and looked at what remained, which was considerably less than what had been there a week ago, and did the exercise she always did when a situation became worse. She looked at it clearly, completely, without performing distress about it, and then she decided what she was going to do next. She was deciding when the morning room door opened and Lady Arabella Forsyth walked in. Vivienne was surprised. She did not let it show, but she was surprised. Arabella had not called before. She was part of the Dowager's immediate circle. She was the woman Lord Aldermere had arranged to be positioned, at various events, as Edmund's eventual intended. She was, by any reasonable social calculation, the last person Vivienne would have expected to find in her morning room on the day after Lady Morecambe's dinner. Arabella sat down across from her. She was perfectly dressed, as always, blush silk, white gloves, golden ringlets with blue ribbon. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her china blue eyes were direct in a way they were not in drawing rooms, and Vivienne understood, looking at her, that this was Arabella without the half-second delay. This was the real expression, not the performed one. Arabella said, "I believe none of it." Vivienne was quiet. Arabella said, "I wanted you to know that. In person." Her voice was steady and without its usual musical calibration. It sounded like a woman speaking from inside herself rather than from the surface. "I also want you to know that I cannot say so publicly, given my family's position and the delicacy of the situation with the Duke." She paused. She said, "I am aware that my silence is a cowardice. I wanted you to know that I know it." Vivienne looked at her for a long moment. The morning room was quiet. Outside, London's ordinary noise moved past, indifferent. She said, "Why are you telling me this, if you can't act on it?" Arabella said, "Because I have been in drawing rooms my entire life in which things were said that I knew to be wrong, and I said nothing, and I have always told myself it was pragmatism." She looked at her gloved hands. "Seeing you at that table last night made me understand the difference between pragmatism and cowardice. I don't intend to stop being pragmatic, but I thought I could at least stop pretending the two things are the same." She stood. She smoothed her skirt. She said, "For what it is worth, which I recognize is not much, you have a better mind than anyone in this season, and you have done nothing to deserve what is being done to you." She went to the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame. She said, quietly, "He watches you, you know. Constantly. He thinks he's being discreet." Then she left. Vivienne sat in the morning room for a moment. She was recalibrating, not Arabella's politics, which she had already partially assessed, but Arabella herself. The woman behind the performance. She had not expected her. She thought she probably should have. She added Arabella Forsyth to the column in her notebook headed, "People who are more than they appear." It was, she noted, getting to be a long column. The story of what happened at White's Club that afternoon reached Vivienne through Lord Aldermere, who heard it from his secretary, who had it from a footman with excellent hearing and no particular loyalty to discretion. Edmund had been in a conversation with 3 men, all from the Crestwood circle, all active participants in the story currently doing its rounds. He had listened for 90 seconds. Then he had spoken. He had said, very quietly, that he had reviewed the circumstances of Miss Ashcroft's time at St. Bartholomew's, and that the characterization being described bore no resemblance to what he had found. He had said that anyone who had spent time in the same room as her would understand that the characterization was not accurate. He had said it once, clearly, and moved the conversation. That was all. No theatre. No raised voices. No formal statement that could be cited or countered. But he had said it in front of the right people, in the right room, at the right moment, and the social permission for the story had narrowed. Not disappeared. Narrowed. Vivienne stood in the corridor of Aldermere House when Lord Aldermere finished telling her, and she put her hand flat against the wall. She breathed. Edmund came home at 6:30. He told her what he had done in the specific, economic tone of a man reporting a fact rather than seeking recognition. He told her as though it were nothing, as though defending her name in a room full of powerful men who had reasons to dislike the outcome was an unremarkable use of an afternoon. She said, "You have made yourself a target." He said, "Yes." She said, "Why?" He looked at her. He said, with the absolute composure of a man who had decided something and was not going to be uncertain about it, because you were telling the truth. Then he went to his study. She stood in the corridor with her hand against the wall and the particular, complicated feeling of someone who has spent 4 years being invisible, understanding that a person has just chosen to stand in front of them and be seen on their behalf. Not from pity, not from obligation, but from a conviction so simple it had no language more complicated than, because you were telling the truth. She had not known what to do with being seen when Lord Aldermere first did it. She found she still did not know what to do with it. The difference was that now it frightened her slightly, which told her something she was not entirely ready to examine.
Before we go any further, if this story is keeping you absolutely riveted, which I think it is, hit that like button right now, subscribe if you haven't already, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and who you're rooting for. Because this is about to get so much more intense.
The message arrived at midnight. The night footman brought it to the hall, uncertain what to do with it, and Edmund intercepted it before it reached Vivienne's door. He read it. He was dressed and in the entrance hall in 4 minutes. Vivienne came down the stairs to find him there, already in his coat, and the expression on his face told her what the message said before she read it. She read it anyway. Dr. Fenwick. Collapsed in his office. Alive. Barely. She was in the carriage before she had finished the sentence, and Edmund was in the carriage before she could prevent it, and neither of them said a word for the entirety of the drive to Bartholomew's because there was nothing to say that was more useful than silence. Fenwick was alive. She stood in the doorway of his office and looked at him, small, rumpled, his white hair sticking up in its characteristic pattern, his wire spectacles on the table beside him, and she breathed through the specific, cold terror of seeing someone you love in a state you recognize as dangerous. She sat beside him. She checked his pulse. She checked his breathing. She checked every indicator she knew with the systematic thoroughness of a woman for whom thoroughness was the only form of feeling she currently had access to. Edmund stayed in the corridor. He did not intrude. He did not offer commentary. He simply remained, present, nearby, a steady shape in the peripheral vision of a woman who needed her hands free and her mind clear. After an hour, she came out. Her face was different from anything he had seen on it before. Not afraid. She was almost never afraid in the conventional sense. Something harder and colder. The face of a woman who has been patient and careful and observant for a very long time and has just reached the precise, specific end of all three. She said, "He's alive because he was meant to be." The dose was calibrated to incapacitate, not kill. She looked at Edmund directly. Which means whoever did this knows Fenwick has access to the original records. The full records. The ones they don't have yet. They kept him alive because they need him to lead them to it. Edmund said, "Where are the originals?" She said, "In the records room. 2nd floor. Filing cabinet behind the anatomy texts, left side." She looked at him. "I need them out of there before morning." He said, "Then we need to go now." She said, "It will require getting past a locked door and a night clerk who is not supposed to leave his post but does, every night at 2, for 20 minutes. He said, "How do you know that?" She said, "I lived in this building for 4 years." He reached past her and picked up his hat. He said, "Lead the way." What followed was the most improbable hour of either of their lives. The records room was on the 2nd floor, accessible through a corridor that smelled of old paper and carbolic, behind a door with a lock that Vivienne addressed with a tool from her medical bag that was technically a surgical implement and practically a very good key. Edmund watched this process with an expression she could not fully read in the dark. Inside, the room was very quiet. Moonlight through a high window. Filing cabinets in 3 rows. She went directly to the left side, 3rd cabinet, and began methodically moving folders. He held the lamp. She worked. They did not speak except in the clipped, direct shorthand of 2 people doing something that required coordination and had no time for social scaffolding. He passed her the lamp when she needed both hands. She passed him folders to hold when her arms were full. At one point she stopped and held up a hand. There was a sound in the corridor outside, footsteps, both of them going completely still in the dark, and the footsteps passed, and she exhaled quietly and went back to work. She found it. A leather satchel, Fenwick's. She recognized it immediately. tucked behind the anatomy texts exactly where she had known it would be. She opened it, checked the contents, closed it. She held it against her chest. She looked up. Edmund was watching her in the lamplight with an expression that was quiet, open, in the specific way he was open only in the dark, or in the early morning before the armor assembled, or in a hospital corridor during a thunderstorm. The expression of a man who has stopped, temporarily, managing his own face. She said, "You are better at this than I expected." He said, "I am better at many things than you have given me credit for." She said, "We'll see." But her voice had something in it that it didn't usually have, a quality of warmth she hadn't planned and couldn't immediately retrieve. He noticed. She knew he noticed because his expression did the small, contained thing it did when he was trying not to show that something had landed. They went out the way they had come in. They locked the door. They walked through the sleeping hospital in the dark, her medical bag in one hand and Fenwick's satchel in the other, Edmund beside her with a lamp, and it was, she recognized this with a kind of startled clarity, the most comfortable she had felt in weeks. In months. Perhaps longer. Moving through a dark and difficult space with someone she trusted. She had not realized she had begun to trust him. She noted it, now, the way she noted symptoms, as information, as data about the current state of things. They did not speak about it in the carriage home. But the quality of the silence was different from any silence they had shared before. Edmund went to his mother the following morning. He did not plan a speech. He did not need one. He walked into her private rooms at the Cavendish townhouse at 10 o'clock and looked at her across the perfectly ordered space, the flowers arranged, the fire correctly built, Margaret Cavendish seated with her embroidery as though the morning were entirely ordinary, and he asked her, quietly, whether she had been in contact with the solicitor who managed the hospital's administrative records. She did not flinch. Her face was immaculate. But he knew her face. He had been studying it since he was old enough to understand that her face and her feelings were two different countries with limited diplomatic relations, and he knew what it looked like when one of them was being controlled very, very carefully. She said, "I have done what I believed necessary to protect this family." He said, "You have commissioned a man you do not fully understand to do things you have not fully considered, and in doing so you have made yourself party to 2 murders. The word landed in the room like something physical. She looked at him fully. He said, "Crestwood is dead. Fenwick nearly died last night. The man you hired is not a solicitor who gossips, Mother. He is a man who kills people when they become inconvenient." She was very still. He said, "I need to know what you authorized and what you did not authorize. Because the difference, legally, is considerable." Her voice, when it came, was controlled in the way of a woman who has spent 35 years ensuring that control was her most reliable instrument. She said, "I authorized the release of information. I authorized the creation of a narrative that would make her position in London untenable. I did not authorize." She stopped. She said, more quietly, "I did not authorize harm." He said, "No. You simply hired a man who had already harmed people and did not inquire about his methods." The silence in the room was very different from the silence she usually maintained there. It was not comfortable. It was the silence of something cracking, not breaking. Margaret Cavendish did not break, but cracking. Showing a line. She said, "She is dangerous to you." He said, "She is the least dangerous person in my life. Every dangerous thing I am facing has come from somewhere else." She said, "You don't see what she..." He said, "I see exactly what she is." His voice was still quiet. It was always quiet. But there was something in it now that had not been there 6 weeks ago, a certainty he had not possessed when the season began, clear and complete and entirely unmovable. "She is the most honest person I have met in 32 years. She is the only person in this city who has looked at what I am, the whole of it, and not required me to be different. She walked through a corridor full of my peers and was not afraid of any of them. She sat beside my father in a hospital ward and made him feel seen when I had not managed to do it in years." He stopped. He said, "She is not dangerous to me. She is the only thing in my life right now that is not." His mother looked at him. She was still immaculate. But her eyes, ice blue, beautiful, and for this one moment, unguarded, showed something she almost never allowed to be visible. She was afraid. Not of Vivienne. Of the look on her son's face, which was the most open she had seen it since he was 11 years old, and still believed that showing her what he felt was something she could be trusted with. She had not been trusted with it since then. She had not deserved to be. She understood this, looking at him, with a clarity she had not previously allowed herself. She said, "Edmund." He said, "I need Graves's full name and the terms of your arrangement. I need them today." He went to the door. He stopped. He said, without turning, "I know why you did it. I know you love me. I need you to understand that those two things do not make it right." He left. She sat for a very long time in her perfectly ordered room, and the flowers stayed arranged, and the fire burned correctly, and the order she had maintained for 35 years held itself together around her while the thing she had built inside it came quietly, completely, apart. Vivienne did not know about the confrontation with the Dowager until later. What she knew, on that same morning, was that she was sitting at her desk with her notebook open, and for the first time in 4 years, she turned to a fresh page and wrote not observations but a question. She wrote, "What do I want when this is over?" She looked at it. It was, she realized, a question she had not permitted herself to ask since she was 20 years old and the house in Cheapside was sold and the future she had assumed would happen did not. She had replaced wanting with doing. She had replaced desire with usefulness. She had made herself so efficient at surviving that she had confused survival with living for 4 consecutive years. She wrote the 4th column heading. She wrote the answer slowly, more slowly than she wrote anything, because it required a different kind of honesty than the kind she applied to problems. She looked at what she had written. She looked at it for a long time. Then she closed the notebook, put it in her pocket, and began to write a plan. 3 days later, she sat across from Viscount Hartwell in a coffee house near the city and asked him for something specific. Not protection. Not intervention. Visibility. She needed it known, through the channels that mattered, through the specific networks that made information travel with authority, that Carlton House had an interest in her continued presence in London. She needed it known quietly, precisely, without fanfare or announcement. Just known. Hartwell looked at her across the table for a moment. He said, "You want us to make you untouchable without making you visible." She said, "I want the right people to understand that touching me is expensive." He said, "There is a meaningful difference between those two things." She said, "I know. I want the second." He said, "Done." He finished his coffee. He said, "I will tell you something, Miss Ashcroft. I have been arranging this kind of thing for 15 years. Most people who come to me ask for protection. They want to be behind something. You are asking to be in front of something." He looked at her with his measuring green eyes. "That is either very brave or very strategic." She said, "In my experience, those two things are most effective when they are the same." He almost smiled. 24 hours, he said. The effect was not immediate. But it was real. By the end of the following day, 2 of the families most vocally hostile to Vivienne's presence in London had gone quiet. The story was still circulating, but its social permission had narrowed, and more importantly, the people who had been participating in what they believed was a purely social matter had begun to understand that there were political dimensions to it that they had not calculated. The campaign against Vivienne did not stop. It became, suddenly, a significantly more expensive campaign to maintain. She moved carefully through the next 3 days. Each conversation a piece of the picture. Each piece placed with the precision of a woman who understood that the difference between information and evidence was corroboration. The widow she visited on a Wednesday afternoon was frightened, a small, thin woman in half-mourning who had been managing a secret for 6 months and was exhausted by the management of it. Vivienne sat with her, direct and gentle, and the woman told her about the letter. The demand for money. The bank account name she had been given. The name was not Graves. It was a shell. Vivienne recognized the structure of it immediately, and she wrote it in her notebook and said, "You have been very helpful. I would like you to stay home on Friday and not discuss this with anyone." The widow said she would be very happy to stay home forever. Vivienne patted her hand and left. Lord Aldermere's legal connections were old and tangled and, when pointed in the right direction, very fast. The shell account resolved to a clerk. The clerk resolved to a solicitor. The solicitor's name was Graves, and his connection to the Duke of Aldermere's estate solicitor was the thread that, when she pulled it, made the entire structure visible. The records room clerk at Bartholomew's was 22 years old and had been bothered by something for 6 months and had done nothing about it because he was 22 years old and the man who had visited was official seeming and the clerk was not in a position to challenge official seeming men. Vivienne sat across from him in the hospital's small anteroom and did not condescend to him and did not perform authority she didn't technically have. She was simply direct and interested in what he knew and entirely, genuinely willing to listen to it. He talked for 40 minutes. She wrote in her notebook. When she left, she had a signed statement, a date, a description, and the specific details of a visit that constituted both evidence of access and evidence of motive. Her picture was complete. That evening, she sat at her desk with the notebook open in the lamplight and looked at what 4 years of careful observation had become. What the hospital corridor had given her. What the season had added. The entire structure of it laid out in her small, precise hand. The solicitor who had been selling records for 2 years, the 2 attacks, the shape of the campaign against her, the dowager's role, the political dimensions, the Carlton House thread running alongside all of it. It was, she thought, an extraordinary amount of information for a woman who was not officially there. She turned to the last fresh page. She began to write the sequence of what happened next. She was interrupted by a knock at her door. She said, "Come in." Edmund opened the door and stood in the frame. He was in shirt sleeves, an unusual dishevelment that told her he had come directly from his study without stopping to reassemble himself, and he had a letter in his hand. He said, "Graves, your solicitor. He made a move tonight." She said, "What kind of move?" He said, "He has approached 3 members of the Lords with a version of your records that he has framed as evidence for a formal inquiry into the administration of St. Bartholomew's. If it proceeds," she said, "it would expose every family in those records publicly, under parliamentary proceedings." He said, "Yes." She looked at him steadily. She said, "He's not protecting himself. He's creating leverage. If the inquiry proceeds, every family he's been blackmailing has more reason than ever to pay him to make it stop." Edmund said, "We have until Monday. The inquiry is on the Lord's schedule for Tuesday." She said, "Sit down." He sat a day. She opened her notebook. She turned it toward him and began to talk. Outside the window of Aldermere House, London moved through its ordinary Friday evening. Lamplighters, carriages, the distant sound of music from somewhere south. Entirely unaware that in a room on the 2nd floor, a woman with ink-stained fingers was laying out the precise, complete architecture of how to bring a murderer to justice before Tuesday, protect every innocent person in a set of records she had spent 4 years keeping, and do it without destroying the family of the man sitting across from her who had, somewhere between a hospital corridor and a darkened records room, become the person she was most trying to protect. She did not examine this last fact directly, but it was there, in the lamplight, as visible as everything else she refused to pretend she hadn't noticed. She talked for 2 hours. Edmund did not interrupt. He sat across from her desk in the lamplight with his long hands folded on his knee and his pale grey eyes moving between her face and the notebook pages she turned with the systematic efficiency of a woman who had been preparing for this conversation without knowing, until tonight, that this was what she had been preparing for. She laid it out in order. The solicitor Graves, his access to the records, the shell account, the widow's testimony, the clerk's signed statement. The 2 attacks, Crestwood's death, Fenwick's near-death, connected by compound, by motive, by the specific knowledge required to execute both without leaving obvious evidence. The dowager's role, not the murders, she was clear about that distinction and she made it carefully, but the commission that had opened the door. The direction given to a man she had not fully understood. She showed him the financial thread. She showed him the clerk's statement. She showed him the structure of the blackmail operation, the families, the payments, the parliamentary inquiry that was not an inquiry but a mechanism of expanded leverage. When she finished, Edmund was quiet. He looked at the documents spread across his desk. He looked at his notebook pages in her handwriting. He looked at the complete, precise, methodically constructed picture of a criminal operation that had been running for 2 years inside the social world he occupied and that had, when it needed a new instrument, used his own mother as one. He said, "How long did you know it was Graves?" She said, "I was certain 4 days ago." He said, "Why did you not tell me 4 days ago?" She said, "Because I wanted to be sure enough that you could not argue with it." He said, "I would not have argued with it." She said, "I know. I wanted to be sure enough that I couldn't argue with it either." He looked up from the documents. He looked at her directly, in the way he had been learning to look at her, without the management of it, without the performance of it. He said, "You do not entirely trust your own conclusions." She said, "I trust my conclusions perfectly. I do not entirely trust that the people I present them to will not find reasons to dismiss them." A pause, brief and precise. "That is not a comment about you." He said, "No. It is a comment about every room you have ever been in." She said, "Yes." The lamp burned between them. Outside, London was quieting into its late-night register. Fewer carriages, fewer voices, the particular hush that settled over the city when most of it had gone to bed and only the people with reasons to stay awake remained. He said, "My mother." She said, "I know." He said, "What she did." She said, "I know what she did. I also know that what she authorized and what Graves did with that authorization are two different legal categories, and I have structured this accordingly." He looked at her. "Why?" She said, "Because destroying your mother publicly would cost you more than it would cost her, and you should not pay for her choices." He was quiet for a moment. Something moved across his face, not the small, contained thing she had learned to read as his version of warmth, but something larger and less managed. Something that had not been permitted before tonight. He said, "Vivienne." It was the first time he had used her name without the miss. Not a slip, he was too precise for slips. A decision, small and entirely deliberate. She said, "Don't." Not unkindly. "Not yet. We have work to do first." He looked at her. She looked back, steady and clear and entirely herself. He nodded, once, and picked up the first document. They worked until 3 in the morning. The arrest happened on a Saturday. Edmund coordinated with Hartwell's office overnight, which meant that by the time the morning light was grey and ordinary over Lincoln's Inn, a Bow Street runner had been briefed, the financial evidence was in the right hands, and the clerk's signed statement had been received by the correct legal authority. The combination of it, the evidence, Hartwell's quiet confirmation that this was a Crown-adjacent matter, Edmund's personal standing, meant that the thing was done cleanly. Graves was taken from his offices at 10:30. He did not make a scene. Men of his particular type, Vivienne had observed, rarely did. They had spent too long being careful to abandon it at the moment it mattered most. The ton would know by afternoon. These things always travelled. But for the space of one morning, Vivienne was simply standing in the morning room of Aldermere House with her empty desk and her closed notebook and the particular, strange quiet of a thing being over. Not peace, exactly. Something more tentative than peace. The feeling of a hand that has been braced against a door for weeks, discovering that the door is no longer pushing back. She did not know what to do with her hands. Lord Aldermere found her there. He came in without knocking, which was his habit, and he looked at her for a moment, standing at the window in the morning light, her auburn hair still in its practical knot, her grey-green eyes very still, and he crossed the room and put his arms around her. It was brief and decisive and entirely without ceremony. A hug that said, "I see you, I am proud of you, I have been frightened for you, and I am not going to make a speech about any of it." She let it happen. She did not pull away. She stood inside it for a moment with her eyes closed and her hands, finally, still. When he stepped back, he looked at her face and said, "Well done." She said, "It was a team effort." He said, with the warm, knowing precision that she had come to understand was his most honest register, "Yes, it was." He looked at her a moment longer. He said, "He'll come and find you, you know. When he's ready. He moves slowly. But he moves surely." She said, "I'm not waiting for anyone." Lord Aldermere smiled. It was the smile of a man who was 67 years old and had been watching people be wrong about themselves for 67 years. He patted her hand and went to have his breakfast. Edmund found his mother that afternoon. Not at the Cavendish townhouse. She had, he discovered, removed herself to her private sitting room at his own house, which was its own kind of statement. He went to her there. She was seated at the window. Not with embroidery. Not with correspondence. Simply seated, looking at the street below, in the particular stillness of a woman who has run out of arrangements to make. He sat across from her. He did not begin with accusation. He had already said the hard things, and they had landed, and repeating them served no purpose. He told her, plainly, what had happened, Graves's arrest, the evidence, the categories of legal exposure. Her face moved through something complicated while he spoke. Not distress, or not only distress. There was relief in it, too, the specific, unwanted relief of a woman who has been maintaining an arrangement she could not fully control and has now had it removed from her hands. He said, "You will retire to the country estate. Publicly, it will be framed as a preference for rural life. The arrangement will hold as long as the arrangement holds." She said, "And if I choose not to?" He said, "Then I cannot protect you from what the evidence shows." She looked at him. She said, "She suggested this, didn't she?" He said nothing. She said, "The country estate. The quiet arrangement. The protection." She looked at her hands. "That is not the move of a woman trying to destroy me." He said, "No." She was quiet for a long time. The room was very still. She said, finally, in a voice that was almost entirely controlled, "She could destroy me. She has everything she needs to do it." He said, "Yes." She said, "And she chose not to." He said, "Yes." Margaret Cavendish sat for another long moment. Her spine was still perfectly straight. Her pearls were still at her throat. Everything about her was still immaculate, because she was a woman who had maintained her armor for 35 years and would probably maintain it for 35 more. But her eyes, when she looked at her son, were the eyes of a woman who had just had something shown to her that she had not been prepared to see. Not Vivienne's mercy, though that was part of it. The look on Edmund's face when he spoke of her. The quality of it. The complete, settled certainty of a man who has found his ground. She had not seen that look on his face since he was 11 years old. She said, very quietly, he was a different child. Before all of it. He said, "I know." She said, "I only wanted." He said, "I know, Mother." She nodded. Once. She looked back at the window. She said, "Tell her." She stopped. She started again. She said, "Tell her that the country is pleasant in the spring." He said, "Tell her yourself." She looked at him. He looked back, steady and clear. She understood, reading his face, that this was not cruelty. It was an instruction. A door being held open. She said, "She won't want to hear from me." He said, "She is more generous than either of us has earned. I suggest you find that before you retire to the country." He left. She sat at the window for a very long time. The meeting with Vivienne happened 3 days later, in the Dowager's sitting room, in the late afternoon when the light was cold and flat and did not flatter anyone. Margaret Cavendish received her standing. This was its own concession, though it would not have looked like one to anyone who did not know her. Receiving a guest standing meant you were not performing the authority of the seated position. It meant you were, in whatever small way she was capable of, attempting something like equality. Vivienne came in without ceremony. She sat down. She waited. The Dowager remained standing for a moment. Then she sat across from her, and they looked at each other, two women who had been circling each other for 6 weeks, in ballrooms and drawing rooms and through intermediaries and through the particular, cold medium of social warfare, and looked at each other plainly, for the first time, without the performance. Vivienne said, "I want to tell you what I intend to do. And what I don't." The Dowager said, "I'm listening." Vivienne said it simply. The arrangement. The country estate. Her silence on the Dowager's commission of graves in exchange for the quiet retirement. The conditions under which the silence would hold and the conditions under which it would not. The Dowager listened. She said, "You could destroy me." Vivienne said, "Yes." The Dowager said, "But you won't." Vivienne said, I will if you make it necessary. I don't think I'll need to. Something moved across the dowager's face. It was not warmth. It would never be warmth. She was not built for warmth in the way of people who have spent a lifetime weaponizing tenderness. But it was something adjacent to recognition. Woman to woman. Survivor to survivor. She said, "He is not easy." Vivienne said, "I know." The dowager said, "He was not always." She stopped. She looked at the window. She said, more carefully, "He was a different child." Vivienne said, "I know that too." A silence. Long and not entirely comfortable and not entirely hostile. The dowager said, "He will not thank you for this. The arrangement. He will consider it a mercy he did not ask for." Vivienne said, "He's not required to thank me." The dowager looked at her directly. She said, "You love him." Vivienne said nothing. She looked back, grey-green eyes level, without confirming it and without denying it, which was in itself a form of answer that Margaret Cavendish was too intelligent not to read. The dowager said, finally, "He loves you also. In case you were uncertain." She said it with the specific, compressed difficulty of a woman for whom saying something like this required more effort than anything she had done in years. He has not known what to do with it. He has been managing it like a problem. He manages everything like a problem. She looked at her hands. He learned that from me. Vivienne was quiet. The dowager said, "Don't let him manage it like a problem." Vivienne said, "I have no intention of it." The dowager nodded. Once. Then she did something that Vivienne had not expected and would think about for a long time afterward. She looked up, and for just a moment, her face was entirely unguarded. Not soft. She was not soft. She would never be soft, but real. The face of a woman who loved her son imperfectly and knew it and had, perhaps for the first time, found someone else who loved him without requiring him to be easier than he was. She said, "The country is pleasant in spring." Vivienne said, "I've heard." She left. In the carriage home, she looked at the London streets moving past the window and allowed herself, briefly, the thing she had been not quite allowing herself for weeks. The specific, complicated feeling of a woman who has been alone for a very long time, understanding that she might not need to be. She put it away. She had one more conversation to have first. Hyde Park on a Thursday morning was grey and cold, the trees still bare, the paths quiet with the particular emptiness of a city not quite ready to believe in spring. Vivienne rode out at 9 and found the Earl of Pembroke waiting at the agreed location with his horse and his excellent posture and his hazel eyes that she now understood completely and could not look at without the odd, dislocating feeling of seeing a piece of yourself reflected in someone who should have been a stranger. He said, "Miss Ashcroft." She said, "Lord Pembroke." They rode in silence for a moment. Then she said, "I know who you are. I have known for several weeks." He went very still on his horse. To his credit, he did not perform shock. He simply received it. The controlled, internal receiving of a man who has been waiting for something and has finally stopped waiting. She said, "I have no intention of using it. Not now. Not in future. I want nothing from you." He said, "Then why?" She said, "Because I have one question." He said, "Ask it." She said, "Did you know she was pregnant?" The morning was very quiet. A bird somewhere. The sound of the horses. Pembroke looked at the path ahead of them, and his face, the charming, handsome, well-managed face of a man who had been liked his entire life, showed, for the first time in her experience of him, something unmanaged. Guilt. 24 years old and not diminished by any of it. He said, "No. Not until after." She said, "Would it have changed things?" He was quiet for a long moment. She waited. She was good at waiting. He said, "I would like to tell you yes." She said, "But." He said, "I was 29 and I was afraid of what it would cost me, and I do not believe I would have been a better man than I was." Vivienne looked at him. She looked at him for a long time, at the hazel eyes that were her eyes in his face, at the breadth of his shoulders, at the easy authority of a man who had never been told no and had, in one specific instance, not told himself no either. She looked at him and she felt, not the grief she had anticipated, not the anger, but but something quieter and more final. The particular, clean grief of understanding that some things simply are what they are. Some absences were not cruelties. They were only absences. She said, "That is the first honest thing you have said to me." She pulled her horse to a stop. She looked at him directly. She said, "I don't need anything from you. I wanted you to have said it out loud. Once. To me." She rode on. Behind her, Pembroke sat on his horse in the middle of the path and looked at nothing in particular for a very long time. He was thinking about a young woman he had not been good enough to deserve. He was thinking about the daughter she had raised in a hospital corridor, who had turned out to be the kind of person he had always intended to be and never quite managed. He was thinking that the cost of being a good man only when it didn't cost anything was that, eventually, it cost everything. He rode home. He sat in his study. He began, for the first time in 24 years, to write a letter he did not know how to finish. Hartwell received her the following week in the same plain room at Carlton House. No ceremony, no grand apartments, just two people who had found a working language and were comfortable in it. He handed her the letter. Sealed, formal, the wax pressed with the specific weight of something official. She opened it. Read it. It was a letter of commendation, signed and sealed, attesting to services rendered to the Crown in a sensitive medical matter. It did not specify the matter. It did not need to. What it did was make her real. Officially, documentably, undeniably real. Vivienne Ashcroft, existing in a document with a royal seal, her name and her competence attested to by a power that no drawing-room gossip and no campaign of whispers could touch. She held it. She said, "This makes me respectable." Hartwell said, "It makes you untouchable." Which is better? She said, "Is there a difference?" He said, "Respectable means they can overlook you. Untouchable means they cannot." She was quiet for a moment, thinking about the hospital corridor floor, and the tallow candle, and Dr. Fenwick pressing bread into her hand in the dark, and 4 years of being the most capable person in every room she was not officially in. She thought about what it had cost, all of it, and what it had built. She folded the letter. She put it in her notebook. It was the only document in there that had not come from her own hand. She said, "Thank you, Viscount." He said, "Don't thank me. I had the easiest part." She left Carlton House into the cold afternoon and walked, not flagging a hackney, not taking the Aldermere house carriage, simply walking, through streets she had learned over 4 years of early mornings and late nights, through the particular London that existed below the Tun's gilded surface, the London of lamplighters and costers and the working city that kept the elegant one running without ever being thanked for it. She walked until she reached St. Bartholomew's. She went inside. Dr. Fenwick's office was warm and overfull and smelled of camphor and old books, which was exactly how it had always smelled, and he was at his desk with papers stacked in the way that suggested a system no one else could navigate, and when she knocked he said, "Come in," without looking up, and when he looked up and saw her his face did the thing it always did, the specific, complicated mixture of pride and suppressed emotion of a man who had believed in something for a very long time and was permanently, quietly moved when it proved itself right. He told her about the position. 3 physicians, emboldened by what had happened, had formally proposed the establishment of an official female consulting role at St. Bartholomew's. Not staff. The system was not ready. A consulting position. A title. A salary. The right to work in the wards she had been working in for 4 years without any of those things. He told her this with his spectacles sliding down his nose and his white hair in its characteristic disarray and his warm brown eyes very bright. She said yes before he finished the sentence. Then she said, "Is it possible to hold a consulting position at St. Bartholomew's and also be a duchess simultaneously, given that I am considering a situation in which both might apply?" Fenwick put down his pen. He looked at her over his spectacles with the expression of a man receiving information he had already deduced 3 weeks ago. He said, "This is the Duke." She said, "I have not decided yet." He said, "Vivienne." She said, "I have not decided yet, Dr. Fenwick." He said, "What is there to decide?" She said, "The terms." He looked at her. He said, slowly, "You are going to negotiate the terms of a marriage proposal." She said, "Obviously." He picked up his pen. He went back to his papers. He was smiling at them rather than at her, which was the specific, affectionate discretion of a man who had known her since she was 20 and understood that she would find direct sentimentality considerably more uncomfortable than competent practicality. He said, without looking up, both. Obviously both. A woman of your competence should be both. She said, thank you, Dr. Fenwick. He said, go home, Vivienne. She went home. The garden of Aldermere House was not, in February, a place of beauty. The hedges were bare and geometrically precise, the flower beds were empty, the gravel paths were cold and slightly damp. It was, by any reasonable assessment, the least romantic garden in London. Edmund was standing in it with his hands behind his back, looking at the wall, when she came outside. She stopped in the doorway. She looked at him, the straight back, the dark hair, the particular quality of stillness he had when he was not managing anything because he was managing everything internally. A man preparing to do something that cost him more than he was going to let show. She went and stood beside him. She looked at the wall with him. After a silence long enough to be comfortable, he said, I have thought about how to begin this conversation. She said, and? He said, I have rejected approximately 17 approaches. She said, tell me one of the ones you rejected. He said, no. She said, all right. Another silence. A bird in the bare hedge. The distant sound of the street. He said, I would like you to stay. She said, I am planning to stay. I have accepted a position at St. Bartholomew's. He said, that is not what I mean. She said, I know. He said, then I would appreciate not having to. She said, you have to say it, Edmund. He turned to look at her. His pale grey eyes were open. Fully, completely open, in the way they had been in a corridor during a thunderstorm and on a terrace in the snow and in the dark of a hospital records room, but more so now, in daylight, with no storm and no darkness to attribute it to. Just him. Just his face, with the armor open. He said, I would like you to stay here. With me. As my wife. He said it the way he said everything, quietly, precisely, without ornament. But underneath the precision was something that cost him enormously, and she could hear it. Because the thought of the alternative is not one I am able to contemplate with any equanimity, and I have tried. A pause. The ghost of something that might, in better lighting, be described as rueful. I have tried quite hard. She looked at him. She felt, in her chest, the specific feeling she had been not quite naming for weeks. The warmth of it, the frightening completeness of it, the feeling of something fitting correctly into a space she had not known was there until it was filled. She said, I am aware that I am not easy. He said, with absolute certainty, you are not difficult. She said, I am difficult. He said, you are honest. That is different. She said, most people find it indistinguishable. He said, I am not most people. She said, no, you are not. The garden was very still. He said, I would like an answer. She said, I'll have one for you in 3 days. He looked at her. 3 days. She said, I have terms. He closed his eyes. Briefly. The gesture of a man exercising patience he was genuinely committed to and finding it genuinely difficult. He said, of course you do. She said, if I tell you the terms now, you'll have time to consider them. He said, I will agree to the terms. She said, you haven't heard them. He said, I will agree to them. He looked at her directly. I trust your judgment better than my own on most things that matter. That is the proposal. Not just the question. The whole of it. She looked at him for a moment. She thought about Lord Aldermere pressing bread into her hand in the dark. She thought about a stone corridor floor and a tallow candle and 4 years of being extraordinarily capable and entirely invisible. She thought about standing at a frosted window and not letting herself look at what was on the other side. She said, that is the best proposal I have heard. He said, you have not heard many proposals. She said, I have heard enough to know what a good one sounds like. She went inside. He stood in the garden for another 10 minutes, looking at the wall, with the expression of a man who has just done the most terrifying thing he has done in 32 years and discovered, on the other side of the terror, that the ground was solid. 3 days later, she came to his study with her notebook. She sat across from his desk. She opened to the relevant page. She said, "My terms." He said, "I'm listening." She said, "I keep my position at St. Bartholomew's. With your formal support, social, financial, and verbal when required." He said, "Yes." She said, "My notebook and its contents remain mine. You will never ask me to use what I know against any person, for any reason." He said, "Yes." She said, "You will not manage my health, my choices, or my movements without my knowledge and my agreement." He said, "Yes." She said, "I will not manage your condition without your knowledge and your agreement. But I will be present. Always. Without being asked." He was quiet. He looked at her across the desk. He said, "That is not a term. That is a promise." She said, "Yes." He said, "I know." A pause. He said, "I have a term of my own." She said, "State it." He said, "You tell me when something is wrong. Not after you have handled it. While it is happening." She said, "That is not a natural instinct for me." He said, "I know. That is why I am making it a term." She looked at him. She thought about the midnight carriage to St. Bartholomew's, and the records room in the dark, and the terrace in the snow, and the corridor during the thunderstorm. She thought about how many times, in 6 weeks, she had been surprised by the steadiness of him when she had been prepared for the performance. She thought about the difference between being alone inside something and having someone stand inside it with you. She said, "Agreed. With the intention of improving." He said, "That will do." She closed her notebook. She said, "My answer is yes." He said nothing for a moment. She said, "Was that sufficiently clear?" He said, "Perfectly clear." He did not move. She said, "Edmund." He said, "I am taking a moment." She said, "Take as long as you need." He looked at her across the desk. The lamp between them. The quiet of the house around them. His face, the most guarded face she had ever studied, the face she had been reading for 6 weeks like a language she was learning in real time, was open. The armor was not gone. It was never going to be entirely gone, and she did not want it gone, because the armor was also him, the shape of what he had survived, and she was not interested in a version of him that had not survived it. But it was open. The door was open. And she could see him, clearly and completely, in the light. She said, "Come here." He stood. He came around the desk. He stopped in front of her and looked at her for a moment, grey eyes steady, the familiar stillness of him, the particular quality of presence he had that had always made rooms reorganize themselves quietly around him. She reached up and put her hand against his jaw. He was very still. She could feel the tension in him, not resistance, but the specific, concentrated stillness of a man who has learned to hold everything so tightly that the act of not holding it required more effort than the holding. She said, quietly, "You are allowed to." He exhaled. It was a very small sound, but it was the most unguarded sound she had ever heard from him, and she understood, in that moment, that this was what it cost him. Not the words, not the proposal, not the terms, but this. The simple act of letting someone be close without managing the closeness. He put his forehead against hers. They stood there, in the quiet of his study, in the lamplight, for a long moment. He said, very quietly, "You are extraordinary." She said, "I know." He made a sound that was entirely, unexpectedly, a laugh. A real one, brief and warm and completely without strategy. She felt it more than she heard it. She smiled. He could not see it, their foreheads still touching. But he felt it. 3 months later, on a Thursday morning in early May, Vivienne moved through the ward at St. Bartholomew's with the confidence of a woman who had been doing this for 4 years, because she had. The morning rounds were hers now, officially, recorded in the hospital's books under her name and her title, consulting physician, which was a title that had not existed 3 months ago and existed now because 3 men had been brave enough to propose it and 1 woman had been present enough to deserve it. She wore a deep blue gown, well cut, good cloth, fitted correctly at the shoulders. Her Aldermere brooch was at her collar. Her notebook was in her apron pocket. Dr. Fenwick walked beside her with his spectacles sliding and his white hair in its customary chaos and the expression of a man in the specific, sustained happiness of someone whose faith has been vindicated. She stopped at a bed near the window. A young woman, 20, admitted with what the previous physician had recorded as exhaustion. Vivienne looked at her for 30 seconds, asked 4 questions, listened to the answers, and revised the diagnosis. She wrote in her notebook. She gave clear, precise instructions to the attending nurse, who received them without the habitual uncertainty that had characterized the first weeks. The nurses had learned, by now, that Miss Ashcroft, the Duchess of Aldermere, though she used the title sparingly inside these walls, did not guess. She said what she knew. What she knew was useful. In the corridor outside the ward, when she came out, Edmund was waiting. He was standing with his coat over his arm and her wool coat in his hands, because February was 4 months ago and this was May, but the morning air was still cool and she forgot her coat every time without exception, which was a fact about herself she was aware of and had not meaningfully addressed. He was reading a pamphlet on surgical advances that she had left in the carriage this morning, because he read everything she left in the carriage, which she had also noticed and had not mentioned. A porter passed him with a sideways look. The Duke of Aldermere in the corridor of St. Bartholomew's Hospital, in his good coat with a medical pamphlet, was not a sight the hospital had previously accommodated. Edmund did not notice the look. He was at the part about arterial suturing. She stopped in the doorway. She looked at him. She had been looking at him for 3 months across breakfast tables and in drawing rooms and during the quiet evenings in the library when they read in the same silence, and she had not yet reached the end of what she found there. She thought, with the calm certainty of a woman who trusted her own conclusions, that she was not going to. He looked up. He looked at her the way he had been looking at her since a hospital corridor in January, completely, clearly, without the management of it. He said, "You forgot your coat." She said, "I know." He said, "You always forget your coat." She said, "I know." He said, in the tone of a man reporting a fact he found both exasperating and entirely acceptable, "One of the nurses gave me a cup of tea." She said, "That was kind of her." He said, "I thought so." He held out her coat. "How long have you been here?" She took the coat. She said, "Since 7. He said, "That is too early." She said, "I had a patient." He said, "You always have a patient." She said, "Yes." She looked at him. "How long have you been here?" He said, "Long enough." She understood, reading his face, that long enough meant he had arrived at 8 and had not come to find her because she was working, and he understood, completely and without requiring explanation, that her work was not an interruption to their life together but the center of it. He had stood in a hospital corridor for an hour with her coat and a medical pamphlet and not once considered it a sacrifice. She reached out and took his arm. He fell into step beside her, tucking the pamphlet into his coat pocket, adjusting his pace to hers without thinking about it. They walked toward the hospital's entrance, through the stone corridor that smelled of carbolic and tallow, past the ward where she had slept on the floor, past the window where she had stood and not let herself look at what was on the other side. She looked now. The street outside was bright with morning. London was doing its ordinary, extraordinary thing, moving and loud and indifferent and full of people who had no idea that a woman had walked through this corridor for 4 years, invisible and extraordinary, and had come out the other side of it into a life that fit correctly at the shoulders. Edmund opened the door. The May air came in, cool and alive. She stepped into it. He followed. They went out into the cold morning together, her arm in his pace matching hers, both of them moving toward whatever came next with a particular, unhurried confidence of 2 people who had chosen each other deliberately, on their own terms, in the full knowledge of what the other was. It was, she thought, considerably better than respectable. It was, for the first time in her life, exactly enough.
And that is the end of our tale. If this story moved you, gripped you, or kept you reading until the very last line, please give it a like right now. It genuinely helps more people find stories like this one. Subscribe so you never miss what comes next, and drop a comment below telling me your favorite moment from this story. Was it the thunderstorm corridor? The negotiated proposal? Or the final image of Edmund standing in that hospital corridor with her coat? I read every single comment, so tell me what you loved. Have a splendid day, and I'll see you in the next one.